At its height, it spanned nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface, ruled over hundreds of millions of people, and shaped the modern world in ways we still live with today. But how did a small island nation, battered by foreign invaders, torn apart by civil war, and overshadowed by continental powers, rise to build the largest empire in history? This is not just a story of kings and queens, of flags planted in distant lands. It's a story of ambition, exploration, trade, brutality, rebellion, war, and innovation. A story written in the language of conquest and resistance. This documentary traces the rise of the British Empire, from its obscure beginnings to its imperial zenith, and ultimately to its decline. We'll explore how it all began, who built it, who resisted it, and what it left behind. But first we must ask, what even is an empire? An empire is a political unit that exerts control over territories and peoples beyond its original borders, often through force, manipulation, or alliances. And Britain wasn't the first to build one. From the Roman Empire to the Mongols, the Ottomans to the Spanish, empires have come and gone throughout history. But none matched the reach, longevity, and influence of the British. In 1913, the British Empire held sway over more than 23% of the world's population, some 412 million people, across Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Oceania. But this wasn't the product of a single grand plan. The empire emerged over centuries, sometimes intentionally, sometimes chaotically. And its legacy is not a simple tale of good or evil. It is complicated, controversial, essential to understanding the modern world. In the next 2 hours we will journey back in time, to the docks of London, the jungles of India, the deserts of Africa, and the islands of the Caribbean, to uncover how Britain built an empire like no other. Let's begin. Before it ruled the waves, Britain was a fractured, vulnerable island on the edge of Europe. In the 15th century, England was emerging from centuries of internal strife, the Black Death, the 100 Years' War with France, and the bloody War of the Roses between rival royal families. Scotland and Ireland were not yet under full English control, and Wales had only recently been conquered. Britain was not a unified, global power. It was inward-looking, surrounded by stronger kingdoms like Spain, Portugal, and France. Those nations, blessed with access to the Mediterranean and early seafaring power, were already racing to explore and colonize new lands. Portugal had reached West Africa. Spain had set its eyes on the New World. And England? It was late to the party. The English crown was weak, its economy unstable, and it lacked the naval technology that its southern rivals had mastered. Yet even in these uncertain times, the seeds of empire were being planted. Trade networks were developing. English merchants, inspired by the profits of European explorers, began to dream of riches beyond the known world. In 1497, an Italian navigator sailing under the English flag, John Cabot, made landfall on the coast of North America. Though it led to no immediate colonization, it marked the symbolic beginning of Britain's overseas ambitions. Still, in this century, England was far from imperial. It was a country that needed to consolidate before it could expand. But in the century to come, as Europe entered the age of exploration, Britain would begin a journey that would transform it from a modest island kingdom into a global empire. The 16th century ushered in a new era, the age of exploration. European powers raced to discover new lands, seek wealth, and spread their influence. England, once a reluctant participant, began to build a navy capable of crossing the oceans. Under Queen Elizabeth I, privateers like Sir Francis Drake challenged the dominance of Spain and Portugal. Drake's daring circumnavigation of the globe in the 1570s stunned the world and brought fame and treasure back to England. But exploration was only the beginning. The British began to establish colonies in the New World, permanent settlements where English laws, culture, and commerce could take root. The first successful English colony, Jamestown, was founded in 1607 in what is now Virginia. It was a harsh and often deadly experience for settlers facing unknown land, disease, and conflict with Native Americans. Despite these hardships, the colony survived, a foothold for England's imperial ambitions. Meanwhile, England's involvement in the lucrative Atlantic trade routes expanded, connecting the Americas, Europe, and Africa in what would become the infamous triangular trade. The early colonies laid the groundwork for Britain's growing global influence. They were more than outposts, they were the foundation stones of an empire. Yet the empire was still fragile, vulnerable to rival European powers, internal struggles, and the harsh realities of the new lands. But ambition and perseverance propelled Britain forward, setting the stage for an empire that would soon grow beyond imagination. One of the darkest chapters in the story of the British Empire is the rise of the Atlantic slave trade. As Britain's colonies grew, so did the demand for labor, especially on the sugar plantations of the Caribbean and the tobacco fields of the Americas. The brutal reality was that this labor came largely from millions of enslaved Africans, forcibly taken from their homes, sold, and transported across the ocean under horrific conditions. British ships became a central part of the triangular trade, carrying manufactured goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, and raw materials back to Europe. This system enriched many British merchants and fueled the empire's economy, but it came at an immense human cost. Resistance and rebellion were common among enslaved people, but the trade persisted for centuries, becoming deeply entrenched in the economic and social fabric of the empire. It would take decades of struggle before Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, and slavery itself in 1833. Yet, the legacy of this period continues to affect societies across the globe to this day. India was the prized jewel of the British Empire, a land rich in resources, culture, and history. British involvement in India began with the East India Company, a powerful trading corporation granted a royal charter in 1600. Initially focused on trade, the company gradually gained political and military power, exploiting the fragmented political landscape of India. By the mid-18th century, following victories like the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the East India Company had established control over vast territories. This marked the beginning of British colonial rule in India, which would last nearly 2 centuries. The British introduced new systems of administration, taxation, and infrastructure, roads, railways, and telegraphs, transforming Indian society. But British rule was also marked by exploitation, cultural imposition, and growing resentment among Indians. The tension culminated in events like the Indian Rebellion of 1857, a major uprising that challenged British authority but ultimately failed to end colonial rule. India's role as the jewel in the crown of the empire was undeniable, a source of immense wealth and influence. Yet it was also a land of resistance and complexity, shaping the destiny of the empire in profound ways. Following its foothold in India, the British Empire expanded further into Asia, driven largely by the East India Company's ambitions. The company acted not only as a trading enterprise but as a sovereign power, maintaining armies, negotiating treaties, and ruling vast territories. Britain extended its influence over regions like Burma, Malaya, and parts of Southeast Asia, competing with other European powers for control. Trade in spices, tea, silk, and opium became central to British interests in the region. The opium trade, in particular, sparked conflict, notably the Opium Wars with China in the mid-19th century. These wars forced China to open its ports to British trade and ceded Hong Kong to Britain, marking a significant expansion of British influence in Asia. The East India Company's dominance eventually gave way to direct British Crown rule after the Indian Rebellion of 1857, but its impact on Asia's political and economic landscape was profound. British expansion into Asia shaped global trade patterns and set the stage for the geopolitical tensions of the 20th century. The expansion of the British Empire was not achieved peacefully. Between the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain engaged in a series of wars that solidified and expanded its overseas dominions. From the 7 Years' War to the Napoleonic Wars, Britain fought rival European powers for global supremacy. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, often called the First World War, resulted in Britain gaining Canada from France and dominance over India. The Napoleonic Wars further cemented British naval power, especially after the decisive Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, which ensured British control of the seas. But imperial conflicts weren't limited to Europe. In India, the British fought numerous wars to suppress resistance and expand their territory. In Africa, clashes with indigenous kingdoms and European rivals marked the scramble for control. The Crimean War and the Anglo-Zulu War are examples of Britain's military engagements to protect or grow its interests. These wars came at great cost, human, economic, and moral, yet they forged an empire built on military strength. Understanding these conflicts is essential to grasping the rise and endurance of British imperial power. Frame picture image prompts 5 only. In the late 19th century, Africa became the new battleground for imperial ambitions. The scramble for Africa saw European powers carve up the continent in a race for resources, territory, and strategic advantage. Britain emerged as a dominant force, securing vast territories from Egypt to South Africa. The construction of the Cape to Cairo Railway was envisioned as a symbol of British imperial unity across the continent. But British expansion was met with fierce resistance from African kingdoms and communities. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 and the Mahdist War in Sudan exemplify the conflicts sparked by imperial intrusion. At the same time, Britain's control over Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, and Rhodesia expanded its influence dramatically. This period was marked by exploitation, cultural clashes, and the imposition of foreign rule on diverse African peoples. The legacies of colonial rule in Africa, economic disparities, borders drawn without regard to ethnic groups, and social upheaval, are still felt today. Britain's empire was held together not just by force, but by a complex system of governance and manipulation. The British perfected the strategy of divide and rule, exploiting ethnic, religious, and social divisions within colonized societies to maintain control. In India, this meant leveraging rivalries between princes, castes, and communities to weaken unified resistance. In Africa, the British often worked through local chiefs and traditional authorities, co-opting them into colonial administration. British colonial governments introduced legal systems, taxation, and education policies designed to reshape societies in their image. Yet these policies also fueled resentment and resistance. From the Indian Sepoy Mutiny of 1857 to the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya during the 1950s, resistance movements challenged British authority at every turn. The British responded with military force, political repression, but also reforms aimed at placating opposition. The empire's governance was a delicate balancing act, combining coercion with collaboration, fear with calculated concessions. This system sustained British rule for centuries but also sowed the seeds of its eventual unraveling. The British Empire reshaped the lands it controlled, not only through politics and warfare, but through culture, infrastructure, and industry. Colonial authorities introduced Western education systems, languages, and religions, often sidelining local traditions and knowledge. English became the language of administration, law, and commerce in many colonies, a legacy that persists in many parts of the world today. At the same time, the British built vast infrastructure projects, railways stretching across continents, telegraph lines linking distant lands, ports to fuel global trade, and roads opening access to resources. These developments accelerated the extraction of raw materials and the export of goods to global markets. Industrialization, fueled by empire, transformed Britain into the world's workshop, while colonies became sources of raw materials and markets for manufactured products. But this progress came with deep contradictions, benefiting British industry while often disrupting traditional economies and societies. The cultural impact was profound, sparking both adaptation and resistance, hybridity and conflict. The British Empire was not just a political or economic system, it was a force that reshaped identities and histories across the globe. The British Empire created one of the most extensive and interconnected economies the world had ever seen. Its vast network linked raw material suppliers, manufacturing hubs, shipping routes, and markets across continents. Cotton from India and Egypt fueled British textile mills. Tea from Assam and Ceylon became a British staple. Sugar from the Caribbean sweetened lives and profits alike. British merchants and bankers controlled trade routes and financial centers, turning London into the heart of global commerce. Ports from Hong Kong to Cape Town bustled with ships carrying goods, people, and ideas. This economic web was not simply about wealth, it shaped politics, diplomacy, and even culture. But the system was unequal, benefiting Britain far more than its colonies. Colonies often became dependent on single crops or raw materials, vulnerable to price fluctuations and exploitation. The empire's economy was a giant engine, powerful, far-reaching, but also fragile and contested. Understanding this economic system is key to understanding the rise, and later decline, of British imperial power. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the British Empire had reached its peak, ruling over 400 million people and nearly a quarter of the world's land. Its influence touched every corner of the globe, from the frozen wastes of Canada to the tropical jungles of Malaya. This vastness created complex social dynamics. In Britain, imperial pride fueled nationalism and a sense of destiny. In the colonies, imperial rule shaped identities. Some embraced British culture and education, while others resisted and fought for self-rule. New social classes emerged and racial hierarchies were entrenched, often codified in law and custom. The empire brought modern medicine, education, and infrastructure, but also exploitation, inequality, and cultural suppression. Its social legacy is mixed, marked by both progress and profound injustice. As the world hurtled toward the 20th century's great upheavals, the British Empire seemed unstoppable, yet cracks were already forming. One of the darkest chapters in the story of the British Empire is the rise of the Atlantic slave trade. As Britain's colonies grew, so did the demand for labor, especially on the sugar plantations of the Caribbean and the tobacco fields of the Americas. The brutal reality was that this labor came largely from millions of enslaved Africans, forcibly taken from their homes, sold, and transported across the ocean under horrific conditions. British ships became a central part of the triangular trade, carrying manufactured goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, and raw materials back to Europe. This system enriched many British merchants and fueled the empire's economy, but it came at an immense human cost. Resistance and rebellion were common among enslaved people, but the trade persisted for centuries, becoming deeply entrenched in the economic and social fabric of the empire. It would take decades of struggle before Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, and slavery itself in 1833. Yet, the legacy of this period continues to affect societies across the globe to this day.